Welcome. This is the C# IDE tips and tricks session. I hope you guys have all been enjoying your time here at PDC so far. My name is DJ Park, and I'm the program manager for the C# IDE, which means that my job is to pretty much make you all as productive as possible whenever you're using C#. Whether that's by designing and pushing in new features, improving existing features, working on things like performance and scalability, or just simply coming out and evangelizing best practices in terms of using the IDE. Now, I've been on the IDE team for a number of years now, and I still have to say that Visual Studio has got to be one of the most intimidating pieces of software that I've ever used. The hundreds of features and options and dials really make it incredibly powerful, but at the same time, I personally find it a little bit challenging to wrap my mind around everything that it can do. Now, I'm sure some of you guys can relate to this, but I often find that I fall into this kind of comfort zone where I have a set of features and a particular workflow that I really enjoy, and I rarely explore outside of that. So the main goal for this particular talk is to push you outside of that comfort zone and make you more productive. We'll be covering a variety of tips and tricks that I've gathered over the years that I've personally found to have shaped my own workflow, in addition to going over some tips and tricks that you can apply to some of the new features in Visual Studio 2010. Now, speaking about productivity, let's take a quick step back and think about productivity from a slightly higher level. More specifically, in terms of the investments that we've made in productivity in Visual Studio over the years, it helps to think about them in terms of general themes rather than in individual features. More specifically, one example here would be modernizing the IDE. So being able to take the look and feel of the IDE and the core capabilities of the IDE and pushing them to the limit. There's another theme around deep insight. So as there's more and more .NET code written every day, whether it's good or bad code, we need to be able to understand it and be able to extract the useful pieces of information from it. So providing the right tools to be able to understand that code. And finally, the last theme here is something I'm going to call speed to solution. We all know that the time to take a project from inception to prototyping to development and testing is becoming more and more critical as to the actual success or failure of a particular project, so providing the right tools to help you get your job done as quickly as possible. We'll be covering a lot of tips and tricks today. They'll be falling into these three rough themes. And don't worry too much about having to take notes on every single thing that I'm going to be saying. I do have recap slides at the end of each of my demos that will summarize all the features that I've actually covered and the keyboard bindings as well. On the way out, also make sure that you grab one of the Visual Studio 2010 key binding pamphlets. We just printed a new set, and these have a lot of useful key bindings that you can use and apply to Visual Studio 2010. Now, before I go into my demos, I just want to take a quick moment also to make a quick announcement. And that's to announce that we'll be partnering with the folks over at DevExpress to release another version of the CodeRush Express add-in. So this is going to work on top of Visual Studio 2010. Now, for those of you who don't know what CodeRush Express is, this is something that we started in Visual Studio 2008, where we worked with the DevExpress folks to provide an add-in, powerful add-in for Visual Studio 2008. This add-in is supported for C# and Visual Basic, and provides a slew of different functionality, ranging from productivity enhancements, TDD-style development, in addition to 50+ refactorings. The best part about this thing is that it's free and downloadable at the following URL. So we'll be releasing the new version of CodeRush Express somewhere around the time when we actually release Visual Studio 2010 as well. So keep your eye out for that. All right, so with that, why don't we go ahead and dive into our first demo. I'm going to switch over to an instance of Visual Studio 2010 Beta 2 here. We'll be talking about the modernizing theme here. The first thing that you see when you open up Visual Studio now is this new start page. The new start page has a different look and feel. It's built in WPF. On the right-hand side, you can see that there's some guide for those of you who are coming to Visual Studio and new to Visual Studio in terms of the different types of development that you can do. But for those of us who are coming from previous versions of Visual Studio, the real gem is on the left-hand side of the pane. We'll start from the bottom left and move up. So on the bottom left here, you can see that there's two new options that are exposed. One option allows you to close a page after the project is loaded. The next option allows you to show the page on startup. Now, personally, I like to have the page show up when I start up Visual Studio so I can see that recent projects list, but I also want to have it closed when I actually go ahead and open up a project. So I'm going to go ahead and enable both of these options. Now, let's go ahead and move up to the recent projects list. For those of you coming from previous versions of Visual Studio, you guys probably realize that you're at the complete mercy of the recent projects list. You couldn't actually remove things off the list and manipulate them. In fact, I was actually talking to some folks at the Ask the Experts thing yesterday, and one of the guys had written a script to actually manipulate and remove and reorder these items. So in the new version of the Start page in Visual Studio 2010, you can hover over a recent project, right-click it, you can remove it off the list now. You also have the ability to pin items to the list, so as you create new projects, they don't get pushed off of the list. Let's move on then. So the new project dialog. I'm going to click that button, and you can see that the new project dialog is also has a new look and feel. The two tips that I want to point out on the new project dialog, though, is on the upper right-hand corner. First of all, you can sort the projects by default now by alphabetical ascending or descending order. That's one of the pieces of feedback we've gotten a lot as well. But my favorite part of this dialog now is this search dialog. You're now able to search all of the installed templates on your disk. You can actually put your cursor into that dialog by pressing Control-E. You can see that my cursor focuses over there. So let's say we wanted to search for all the C# web templates. I can type C# and web. It'll filter my view down to all of the C# web templates on my box, and I can go ahead and create that. Now that we've taken a quick look at some of the new look and feel, let's talk a bit about customization. One of the things that I do whenever I start playing with an application is go through all the menus and all of the options just to make sure that I can customize it just to the way that I want it. I personally happen to be a very keyboard-heavy user, so I like to make sure that all the key bindings are bound exactly the way I want it. And in Visual Studio, it turns out that you can control this by going to Tools, Customize, and on the bottom right here, you can see there's a button called Keyboard. If I click that, it'll bring up an options dialog that gives you access to literally all of the Visual Studio commands. If I scroll down here, you can see all the commands here. So for example, let's say we want to take a look at the close document command. I can type close document in the search box. And you can see that this close document window command is currently bound to escape for work items. And if I drop this down, you can also see that it's bound to Control F4. Now, I personally hate having to press Control and then reach over and press F4 every single time I want to close a document window. So I'm going to go ahead and bind this to Control semicolon. So now I can assign it to that, and it'll override it. And every time I want to close a document window, Control semicolon will go ahead and do that. Some other examples of key bindings that I like to change are Add New Project. Rather than having to go to the Solution Explorer, right-click on the solution node, drop down, scroll down, and get that, go select Add New Project, I can go ahead and bind this to Control-Shift-P. And first of all, notice that this is actually bound to Run Temporary Macro, but I don't personally use this as much, so I'm going to say Assign, and then it'll override that with Control-Shift-P. Similarly, if I wanted to add a new reference, I having to go to the Solution Explorer and say Add Reference, so I'm going to do something similar and say Control-Shift-R, should cause that to happen. And again, we'll be overriding the record temporary macro. All right, so we've taken a look at how we can customize keyboard shortcuts. Let's take a look at how we can customize context menus as well. This is something that is not very widely known, but it turns out that you can go to the Commands tab in the Customize dialog, click the Context menu node. If I click this dropdown, you have access to every single context menu in Visual Studio as well. Scroll down and just give you an idea of what that looks like. Let's go ahead and say we want to look at the code window context menu. You can see that there's a whole bunch of different commands listed in this view. The reason for that is a lot of these commands are shown contextually. We don't actually show all of these, obviously. And let's say that we wanted to remove this generate sequence diagram command from the context menu to kind of clean it up. I can go ahead and delete that. And if I wanted to move things up and down, that's easy to do as well. So we've taken a look at customizing keyboard shortcuts. We've taken a look at customizing context menus. Another way that users typically customize their Visual Studio environment is through add-ins and extensions. And for those of you coming from previous versions of Visual Studio, you know that it was typically very difficult to find the extensions, install them, and manage them, and just overall just kind of use the add-ins. So in Visual Studio 2010, there's a new feature called Extension Manager, which you can access by going to Tools, Extension Manager. And you can see here now, I have a view of two different extensions that I have installed here, the Source Outliner and the triple-click extensions. I'll be demoing these later. You can disable them, uninstall them directly from this view. And best of all, you can click this Online Gallery view. And what this is going to do is go hook up with the visualstudiogallery.com website and pull in all of the extensions that are available there. Allow me to sort them by highest rated, most downloads, and et cetera, and also search the gallery as well. Let's give it a second to grab all the data. There you go. So now you have a view of all the different extensions that are available on visualstudiogallery.com, directly from within Visual Studio. OK. Now, the last tip that I want to share with you in this section is around multi-monitor support as well. So again, if you're coming from a previous version of Visual Studio, you know that the support for multi-monitor scenarios was actually very poor. You couldn't drag document windows off to other monitors that you have, and everything was constrained within typically one monitor. But in Visual Studio 2010, we've done some work to redo the Visual Studio shell in WPF that has enabled us to support this scenario a little bit better. So for example now, you can go ahead and click and drag a document window. That'll go ahead and tear this off. You can move it, obviously, to different monitors in this case. You also have the ability to treat this like a normal window. So if you go ahead and double-click this, it'll maximize the window. Double-clicking again will minimize. We've also hooked up the window to the Win7 gestures as well. So if you're familiar with the Windows key left-right combinations to actually move windows from screen to screen, you can do that as well. So for example, Windows left, we'll go ahead and dock this, in this particular case, to the left-hand side of my screen. But if I had multiple windows, it would actually push it to other monitors as well. My favorite tip that I'll end off with here is that rather than having to click and drag the window and try to put it back into the Visual Studio shell, I can go ahead and control double-click. And that'll go ahead and pop that right back in for you. So control double-click, pop it out. Control double-click to pop it right back in. All right, let's take a quick moment to take a break and summarize what we just covered. So we took a look at start page enhancements, the new look and feel, being able to pin and remove items from the recent projects list, being able to control different options directly from the start page as well. Took a look at the ability to sort and search in the new project dialog. That Control-E shortcut's actually quite handy, so go ahead and use that. Took a look at the extension manager, being able to easily find and install and manage your extensions on your Visual Studio box. Saw some different enhancements for multi-monitor scenarios, being able to move them between monitors using Win7 gestures and also being able to float and dock them. And finally, we took a look at customizing the environment as well, so customizing keyboard shortcuts and context menus. Now, the next demo, I'm going to be talking about the deep insight theme that we mentioned before. I'm going to switch back over to my instance of Visual Studio here. I'll close the start page. And I have a project called the Card Game project loaded here. This is a fairly simple project. It's simply a blackjack game. I'll press F5 now to run it for you, show you what it does. I can say New Game. And you can see here now that I'm a cat called Karen. And I can go ahead and bet $100, $10, and so on. Very simple game. Now, whenever you inherit a project like this, one of the first things that you typically want to do is try to get a high-level architectural view of how all the types and members are related. In Visual Studio 2010, there's a feature called the Architecture Explorer, which you can access by going to View, Architecture Explorer. This will go ahead and bring up a new tool window that gives you a class view or solution view of your project. It's similar in some ways to the object browser and class view that already exist in Visual Studio, but it's also slightly different in the sense that you can drill into, let's say, the namespaces, see all the types that are contained in the namespace, and if I click on particular types, you can see all the different members that are available there as well. The one tip that I want to share with you here, though, is that if you go ahead and click on the actual column that specifies the node that you're looking at, node type, it'll expand that out and allow you to filter down to specific types of nodes. So for example, right now we're selecting all types in my blackjack namespace, right? But if I wanted to only look at the classes, I can go ahead and click that. It'll show me only the classes. Enums, only the enums. And if I click the enum, it'll show me all the members and so forth. One of the other differences the Architecture Explorer has with the object browser and the class view is that the underlying data model is actually a graph data model rather than a tree data model. So what that allows us to do is provide you guys with some interesting visualizations as well. The way we're going to do that is by going to Architecture, Generate Dependency Graph, and let's go to Custom. We're going to take a view of all of the different elements that are inside my actual project. And we'll leave the accessibility alone for now. We'll include all the accessibilities. If I go ahead and press OK, that's going to create something called a dependency graph for me. I'll clean up my environment here. And this allows me to drill in and see all the namespaces that are contained within my exe and all the types that are contained within my namespace and so forth. Now also notice that you can see the different strength of the relationship between these different types as well based on the thickness of the line. If I go ahead and expand out my types as well, you can see all the members that are contained and so forth. Now, this is pretty straightforward, but one tip that I want to share with you with the Architecture Explorer that can be quite handy is as follows. You can actually go to Architecture. Let's go ahead and create another dependency graph. Select Custom. Instead of viewing everything, like assemblies, namespaces, and types, let's say that we only want to look at methods. This isn't a very common scenario, right? And let's say we want to only look at methods that are exposed in public types. If I go ahead and press OK, we're going to get a view of every single method that's exposed in a public type in my project and how they're related. Obviously, here you can see that there's a lot of methods, and it's hard to extract useful information. You can press Control and scroll in with your mouse to zoom in. Also, Control and click and drag will pan the view for you. But better of all, you can actually press Control F. And let's say there's a specific member that you're looking for. In this particular case, we want to look for endgame. You do a find. It'll go ahead and refocus the view for you, so endgame is in view. And we can see here that endgame is related to all these different other members in the project. But it's still a little bit complicated, right? So this dependency graph also has a feature called the butterfly view. So you can access that by pressing this button over in the toolbar. And if I go ahead and press that, it'll get rid of everything else that doesn't matter anymore. You basically have a call graph of everything that goes through endgame. You can alter the view. I personally like to see things from left to right. So here we go. Now we have a left to right call graph. You also have the ability to narrow down how many links, how deep you want this call graph to be by pressing this toolbar button up here. You can see that I can control up to 7 links here. Let's say we just want to view up to 2 links. And immediately now we have a quick view of everything that impacts endgame. We can see that you can end the game simply by pressing the double down button, hitting, dealing, and stand. So these are the 4 ways that you can end the game. Now you have a pretty much overall view of how you can end the game. All right, let me go ahead and close that out. Now that we've taken a look at the high-level overview, the next thing that we typically want to do is actually go into some code now. I'm going to go ahead and double-click on my player type here. That'll navigate me over to the player.cs class. Now, one of the first things that you typically want to do when you look at a source file is to understand the shape of the file. You can do that simply by kind of dragging the scroll bar up and down, but that's usually not that effective. So I'm going to now refer back to one of the extensions that I had installed on my box earlier, the source outline view. You can access that by going to View, Other Windows, and clicking Source Outline or Power Toy. This is going to go ahead and bring up a document outline-like view of my entire source file. So you can immediately see here now that I have fields, properties, and a couple methods in the bottom. You can also navigate to them by clicking on them. You have the ability to search and filter down the list, and so forth. I suppose you can also do this by simply going into the new editor and pressing Control and using the mouse wheel to zoom in and out and getting a sense of what the source file looks like. But granted, the source outliner is a lot more useful for this. Now that we have a high-level overview of the source file, let's go ahead and take a look at how some of the pieces of the source file are put together, how they're tied together. So one of the first things that I'm going to do here is put my cursor on the balance field. And you can see that after a short delay, the balance field is highlighted. And if I scroll down a little bit, other instances of balance are also highlighted down below. I'll scroll down a little bit more so people in the back can see. Now, this is a new feature in Visual Studio 2010 called Highlight References. And it allows you to visually see all of the different references in your file. But the real power of Highlight References comes in its navigational capabilities. You can actually press Control-Shift and down. I'll go ahead and do that now. Notice that my cursor jumped to the lower instance of balance. If I press Control down again, it'll bring me down to the next instance, and Control-Shift down will continue to bring me down to all the other instances of balance in this particular file. So I can continue to do so, and I can press Control-Shift up to go right back up. All right, so now we're focused on the increase bet method. It's a fairly straightforward method. It checks to see if the user has enough money, and if they don't, you throw an exception saying that the user doesn't have enough money. Now, one of the things that you typically want to do when you take a look at source files is, let's say like this else block. We actually don't want to view it anymore. But unfortunately, there's no way to actually collapse it or get it out of my view. But it turns out that in Visual Studio 2010, you can right-click an arbitrary block of code, go to Outlining, and use a command called Hide Selection. You can also access this by using Control-MH. This will create an ad hoc block of code that you can collapse and expand. All right, so now that, now that we understand how the increased bet method works, we actually want to see how it's used in the project as well. Typically, if you're coming from a previous version of Visual Studio, the way you would do this is by putting your cursor on a member, right-clicking, or using the keyboard shortcut to use Find All References. This goes ahead and brings up the Find Symbol Results window. And when this window is up, when any list window is up, actually, you can press the F8 key, and that'll iterate you through all the different results in that window. So if I press F8, this will take me to the next instance of increased bet, which you can see here is called in double down. I'll press it again. It actually finds the original increased bet method. F8 again will actually take me to the bet method and show me that it's called in bet as well. In Visual Studio 2010, there's another way to do this, to get the quick information. What is calling this method? You can right-click on a method now and say, View Call Hierarchy. This is actually going to bring up a new tool window called the Call Hierarchy tool window, which allows me to expand and immediately see all of the callers and calls to a particular method. Now, we've taken call hierarchy a little bit further now and also integrated it with another tool window in Visual Studio called the code definition window. I'll bring that up. I'm going to go ahead and dock this over on the right-hand side at the bottom here. You can see now that as I click on different members in the call hierarchy tool window, it's going to go ahead and update the code definition window for me on the right-hand side. So we don't have to actually go ahead and lose our focus in the main window up here. You can basically do the code exploration on the bottom side of the window. All right, so we've taken a look at how to get a high-level architectural overview of a project, how to take a source view of a project and understand the source. Another typical scenario where we try to understand code is during debugging as well. So I'm going to go ahead and press F5. This will launch the project. Let's say that we want to play quick game of blackjack now. We're going to say, new game. Let's bet $100, and let's add another 10 on here. Notice that the actual bet went up by $125, or $25, right? So obviously there's a bug here now. So let's try to figure out what's going on. And to do that, we're going to use a new feature in Visual Studio 2010 called IntelliTrace, which allows you to step back in time and kind of step through all the different events that happened in your project over that lifetime of the application. We're going to go ahead and say break all. So now you have a view of all the different events that have been going on. You can go to the very beginning. You can see where the application started, where I clicked new game, and the state of the application when I clicked new game. We can go ahead and a little bit further down and click on the 10 button, where I saw the bug, right? And you can see that when I clicked on 10, for some reason, the 25 button click event handler got fired. So obviously, there's some kind of error going on there. Before I go ahead and try to figure out what's causing this to happen, I'm going to go ahead and hover over the 25 button click method here. And notice that on these new data tips, there's a little pin icon on the right-hand side. You're now able to click on those, drag this into view for you, and pin your data tips onto your actual editor view so you don't actually lose them. And even better, you're able to add comments to them by pressing that button and say, this is where my error is. So if I have to leave, go for lunch, lose my debugging session, I can come back and know where the error is. All right, so now that I've actually identified where the error is, let's go ahead and press Shift F12 to do Find All References once more to see where this actual 25 button click event handler is being called. I'll press F8, step through. I'll hide this window for you so you can see that. And you can see now that obviously the 25 button click event handler is going to get tied to the 25 button click event. F8 once more. And you can actually see this is where the actual bug is, right? You can see that this event handler is being tied to the 10 button.click event. So let's go ahead and fix this error and hook it up to the correct handler. So now we fixed the error, and let's go ahead and rerun the app. I'm going to go ahead and end this game, start a new instance of the game. We'll bet 100, add another 10, and there we go. Now we fixed the application. OK. Let's switch back over to slides now and do a quick recap of what we covered. We just covered a whole bunch of things. We took a look at high-level understanding. We saw the Architecture Explorer and being able to use the call graph kind of functionality with Architecture Explorer. Took a look at various different tips and tricks that you can apply when trying to understand source. We saw the source outliner power toy, which you can grab off of the extension gallery. We saw the ability to zoom in the new editor. highlight references, and being able to navigate with the Control-Shift up and down keyboard shortcuts, being able to select the block of code and arbitrarily collapse and expand it, iterating through list windows using the F8 key, and finally, the call hierarchy tool window that you can actually integrate with the code definition window as well. We also took a look at the debugging scenarios as well, so being able to use IntelliTrace to step back in time and trace the lifetime of your application, and kind of a fun thing, being able to pin your data tips and add comments to them as well. We'll hold the questions off to the end. All right, so the final theme that I mentioned earlier was a speed to solution theme. So I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio 2010 again. Now, for this particular demo, I'm actually going to switch to another instance of Visual Studio, and we're going to create a new project. We're going to create a Twitter application that's going to be able to take a hash that's passed in and search through the Twitter search APIs and return all the results of the Twitter search. We'll use a test versus driven style of development, so I can show off some of the new features that you can use in those areas. So the first thing I want to do is create a console application. We'll go ahead and name that Twitter search app. We'll use that keyboard shortcut that we bound earlier, Control-Shift-P, to add a new project now. And Control-E brings our focus up to the search area, and we can say C#test, because we want to add a test project to this application now. Let's go ahead and name this Twitter test. Pressing OK, we'll go ahead and add the Twitter test application to this. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and add a reference from the Twitter test project over to the Twitter search app so we can do all the testing. I'll press Control-Shift-R to bring up the add reference dialog. And first of all, let me just say, it came up, yes. So it's first of all, you can notice that it's focused on the project tab. And while that's going on, if you switch over to the .NET tab, we're actually asynchronously loading all of the assemblies in the add reference dialog now. So you don't have to wait for it to come up anymore. It's a long time coming. Let's go ahead and add a reference to Twitter search app now. All right, so we're ready to actually start coding. Let's go ahead and name our class Twitter class. And the actual test method, Twitter search test. The first thing I want to do in my Twitter search test is to create an instance of, let's say, a Twitter object. That seems like a pretty common, like a pretty appropriate name, and make an instance of that. So I'm going to say Twitter and type space there. But notice that IntelliSense here is actually stomping over what I'm writing. This is a common problem that users run into as they're doing test-first development. So the problem here is that Twitter class is actually in the IntelliSense list already, so by pressing a completion character, it'll go ahead and complete that for you. So the way in Visual Studio 10 that we've addressed that is by introducing a new mode to IntelliSense called suggestion mode. You can access this by pressing Control-Alt-Space. Notice what happened to my IntelliSense list. Let me do that one more time for you. Control-Alt-Space. Notice that Twitter class is no longer fully selected. It's actually partially selected on the outside. And there's a new field that's inserted to the top of my IntelliSense list, including what I actually typed. So at this point, if I go ahead and press space, it doesn't actually stomp over what I've been writing. I can go ahead and complete my thought now. Say Twitter T is equal to new Twitter. And as expected, Twitter isn't defined, so it's going to be underlined with a red squiggle. If I go ahead and hover over that, you can see the error telling me that Twitter is not defined. You also notice that there's a small rectangular box here that if you hover over it, like I just did, you can click it and see all the different options that are available to you at that particular location. Rather than using the mouse in this location, though, one of the best tips that I can offer you is actually anytime you see one of those small rectangular boxes, you can press Control dot, and it'll bring up the smart tag dialog for you, giving you all the different options that are available at that point. And you can see here that you can generate a class for Twitter, which will generate the Twitter class into my test application. But that's not what we want, right? We want to actually generate that into the console application that we created. So I'm going to say generate new type. This brings up a new generate new type dialog, which gives me access to all the different kind of parameters on the type I'm going to generate, in addition to the project that it's going to generate into. So I can go ahead and say generate into my Twitter search app. We'll go ahead and generate Twitter into the program.cs file as well. And if I press OK, you can see that Twitter is now colorized. It's bound, it's generated, And also the using directive for Twitter search app is included at the top of the file. So all that stuff is being done for you by this feature. So now we can move on. The next thing that we want to do here is actually do the search off of this Twitter object and return the list of results and store it in a list of string, let's say. We'll name the variable results, and we'll name the actual method search for hash. Again, this is not defined, but I just know that I want to call it search for hash. I'll use a new C# 4.0 language feature here now called name parameters, which allows me to explicitly refer to a method parameter by name. So I'm going to say the method parameter name is going to be hash. We'll use semicolon and pass in PDC09 hash. So now I've finished my method call. We're done with this particular line of code. I can go ahead and press Control Dot to bring up that smart tag menu. You can see that we can generate a method stub for search for hash in the Twitter class.